Hi, so I'd like to start by sharing my screen with you if I can figure out how to do that. I want to talk about chapter 1. And chapter 1 sets the tone for the whole book. And so what we learn about in chapter 1 is very important. See if I can get this over here where I need it. So, like I said, this chapter sets the stage for everything that you're going to learn throughout the course. So I want to talk to you for a while on this video. And part of the reason why I want to do that is that means that you also won't need to read the entirety of chapter 1, only the pages that I've pointed out. So let's talk about this reflection and action. And when we talk about counseling, counseling relies on developmental psychologists for all of the information that they use in their studies, for in their practice, so that counselors can know how to help people. And developmental psychologists rely only on empirical evidence for their studies, and sometimes what counselors see in their clients or their students doesn't appear to adhere or agree with what the information is that can be gleaned from these empirical studies, because, you know, they would really get upset if we took the top off their head and played around in that brain. So we just kind of have to do a lot of this based on objective observation, and also on what people tell us. And so that makes studying people a whole lot different than studying other things like rocks and weather patterns and that kind of stuff. So one thing that's important to know is that research is based on a population sample, and we prefer that that population sample be a large sample so that we have a better idea. I used to use this example a lot with my undergraduate students in research when we were talking about what would be a good population sample. And I would say to them, if you want to know how many 10-year-olds know the creation story, would going to a church be a good place to get your sample of 10-year-olds? And of course, the obvious answer is no. Most of those children are going to know the creation story. So for that particular research, you would want to go to schools and clubs and different places so that you got children who had been raised in church and also children who had not. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about population sample. And there's always going to be an exception to every rule. And knowing, even though there's always going to be exceptions, knowing the information from those studies will allow you to be much better prepared to offer your client scientific-based information, and also will allow you to have counseling techniques that are based on what they can understand. So, for example, by knowing that children don't develop a good theory of self, which means that they don't know that other people are not thinking the same things that they're thinking and wanting the same things that they're wanting, they don't really develop that generally until about 3 or 4. So if you're counseling a 4-year-old and you're trying to counsel them in the same manner that you would a 10-year-old, you're probably not going to get the same results. And that's why children have a really hard time understanding why it's not okay for them to do certain things until they reach a certain age. So they may not understand that taking something away from another child is not okay until they reach a certain stage. So I think this last bullet point is so important. And as you'll probably see when you read the stories in this week's discussion board, there may be more than one person that provides information or tells a story about a particular genetic disorder or disease, but that very personal story that they share may still be very different. And that's because, unfortunately, many times what we call our personal knowledge, things that we've seen, don't necessarily always line up with what research says. And that doesn't mean that either you or your personal knowledge or the research is wrong. It just means that you may have had experience with one of the outliers that didn't meet the norm for that research. Does that make sense? If you've not already taken a questionnaire about your beliefs on development on page 5, I think that if you will do that, that would be a real interesting thing for you to look back on at the end of the course. You all come into this course with your own thoughts and beliefs about human nature, and most of those beliefs are based on our own experiences, or what I like to call mama says. My mama, and your mamas may not be like mine, but my mama has some very strong opinions, and just like me, she's real willing to share them. So those are our truths growing up, is whatever our parents and our caregivers tell us. And then as adults, the things that we see in work and whatever our experiences are. But when we work as a counselor, we have to move past our truths. And those are generally they're generally true as we've experienced them. How about that? And probably the best way to explain that is, well, let me just tell you my story. This is a personal example. So you'll all understand that we're all prone to those same fallacies about believing that our personal knowledge or our personal experience is the way it actually is, if that makes sense. So we've all heard about the likelihood that teen mothers will not be self-sufficient, and even more frightening is that their children many times are not self-sufficient. They're not successful without some pretty strong interventions, because that family will live in poverty and they won't have the same family support and they won't have the same opportunities as a family that waits until later to have children, or two-parent families. And I've always struggled a bit with those statistics. In fact, I used to argue with those statistics, but unfortunately, I've come to realize that maybe they're true in many cases. But I had all 3 of my children before I was 19. And I went to work full time after I had the first one. I was a high school dropout. And I took care of them the very best that I could, except for when I was working, and then I had child care for them. And I think they turned out pretty good. Now, that may be in spite of me, but I went back to college when they were very young, when they were in elementary school. I started that trip when my oldest one started school, and I realized, wow, I'm not going to be able to afford to support these children on what I can make. And so I went back to college, and they actually had a lot of experience with college and university, because there were sometimes I didn't have daycare, and so they went with me. but they've all three earned a bachelor's degree. One of them's earned two bachelor's degree, and two of them work in professional jobs. They all support their families. One of them, a girl, actually works in construction, and of course, we know that those folks makes lots of money. So I think that they really have done real well. Now, my last child, who is actually not my natural child, obviously, but that child has some challenges, and they're probably not going to attend college because he still can't read and he's 14. But you can see how I would struggle with those statistics, knowing that the children that I birthed as a teen mother and raised as a teen mother were all successful. Anyway, that's my story. And that is my personal knowledge. But unfortunately, I think that I may be one of those outliers, and that if you took 1,000 people who was a teen mother, then it might not be the same statistics. Does that make sense? So they don't have relevance. Statistics and research don't have relevance generally when you're looking at a single instance. It's when you look at this whole large sample of teen mothers and how their children fare that would then be important. So I hope that makes some sense. But as counselors, the important thing to remember is that whatever our personal truths are, we need to go by whatever the research says, because while we may have known an outlier who did not fit that norm, they actually call them knew someone who, and that can be who did whatever. But anytime you talk about statistics, you're going to have somebody who says, well, I knew somebody who blah. So that's what we call the I know somebody who. So let's move on to some of these theories. And the first ones that we're going to talk about in this first segment are what we call stage theories. And Charles Darwin is probably not a new name to most of you. And Darwin is famous, or maybe infamous, for his theory of evolution. But it's important to note that Darwin was not the first person who believed in evolution. He was just the one to first publish a theory about how he believed that worked. So, and it was a very stressful thing for him. The idea of how people were going to respond to this bizarre theory, I mean, he knew that that was not acceptable in his time. It was so traumatic that it took him 22 years to publish that theory. And it really affected his health during the time that he was doing the research for it. But another thing that he did that is much more important in this course is that he fostered an interest in studying infants and small children. And while he was not the first one to do that, he was important enough because of his other research that people took notice. And he wrote what he called a baby biography about his son's development. And I think your textbook points out that middle-class occupations that required that education in reading and writing and math brought about a need to educate large numbers of children. And from that came some public interest in understanding how children change with age, so that they knew what was appropriate to do in their education. And so I'm going to talk in the next few slides about some more of the classic theories that we still use in part today, and also some ways that we've moved past them. And one of the ways that we still use them today is that they still are the very easiest to work with as far as looking at children's development. And that has kept them front and center, even though that we know now that some of the stages are not necessarily accurate. So originally it was believed that children would walk and would talk by age 1, and at the same time that they would be at a certain place developmentally, and I mean cognitively, and that they would also be at a certain spot in their psychosocial development. We now know that it's about practice and as well as genetics and all of these other things. And so they may be really high in their ability, their cognitive ability, but if the baby is overweight, then they may not walk as fast as other children, because we know that learning to walk is practice and muscle tone and size, because it takes more muscles to hold up a larger infant than it does a smaller one. So they may not develop in all of these areas at exactly the same time, but we'll talk about that more later. So one of the most famous, of course, classic theories was Freud. And even though Freud and Erikson and all of those have these stage theories that we're going to talk about in this first one, if they don't know about any of the others, they're probably going to know about Freud. He's the theorist that most people will know, even if they've never taken a psychology class, because we talk about Freudian slips, and because his theory was just a little bizarre, especially in the naming. I think it tends to be, he was just a bizarre man. There was a time when he really felt like that cocaine was the answer to all of our medical issues and psychological issues. And so, but he still has some good information, and I still think it's important that we know it, especially since it will probably be on whatever certification test that you take. So, and it was also part of your assignment this week. So I do want to talk about it just a little bit. There is a video about Freud's theory in this week's folder, and I do recommend that you watch it, because we do still pull from this theory, like I said, in some areas. And Freud believed that everybody's personality was a combination of 3 parts. The id, which develops first. In fact, he believed that babies were born with it. And it's that hedonistic part that wants what it wants, regardless of what anybody else might think, or whoever might be hurt by it. That's unimportant. It pursues the fulfillment of instinct. So like hunger and sex and thirst, those are all primary instincts that would be part of the id and what it would pursue. And then the superego would be the last part that develops, and it is sometimes referred to the parent part of the personality. So it's the one that's full of shoulds. Sometimes they call it the preacher. It's the one that makes us feel bad if we don't meet those shoulds, those things that we have been taught are right. And that teaching may come from parents or teachers or religious leaders or other leaders in authority. But the ego, which develops in between there, but I think it's easier to understand once you understand the 2 opposite poles, it actually develops to control those irrational impulses of the id, but it also mediates between the unrealistic needs of the id and the unrealistic needs of the superego, because there's no perfect people. So this was his belief, was that there were these 3 parts, and that the purpose of the ego is to integrate the needs of satisfying and pleasing that id, and also appeasing the superego in a way that doesn't leave the person feeling guilty and unhappy. So Freud's biological stages, that was his personality theory. He thought he knew it all, bless his heart. And his person, I'm sorry, but it is true. He really did have a grander theory, if you will, than many developmental theorists. His biological stages of development are fairly straightforward, and he believes that The id energy drives the move to that next stage. That hedonistic energy drives the move to the next stage. And his stages are in part, especially the first couple, pretty sensible. I think that we can all agree that infants explore, how about that? The world by sticking things in their mouth. They get their nourishment from suckling, and that's an innate need that they're born with. That's an ability or in reflex they're born with. And so if you watch any infant, whatever they can get goes in their mouth. I have a granddaughter who is now almost 10 months old. And she has, over the last few months, it's been comical to watch her. She's had her toes in her mouth. Anything that she can manage to stuff in there, and sometimes stuff is the word, she puts in her mouth: toys, keys, phones, whatever. Anything that she can manage, she will stick it right in her mouth. And so he believed that the baby's experience with feeding and those other parenting behaviors were likely to determine how much energy the child invests in that need in the future. So if they were denied the need to suck enough, to put enough things in their mouth, to have enough stimulation, oral stimulation, then that might result in an oral fixation that would cause the child, when they grew up, to need more oral stimulation than other adults. And they would get that oral stimulation, according to Freud, through overeating and smoking and talking too much. Wonder how much I was denied oral stimulation as a child. Maybe I know what's wrong with me. But Freud would say that those are overt signs, but that there might be also some more subtle signs, like crying easily or feeling helpless. And Freud was pretty sharp, because there was really no way to disprove his theory, because he would say that not enough or too much could cause these things. And so there was no way to prove him wrong, because the behaviors could either come from overstimulation or from understimulation. And his second stage was the anal stage, and that's kind of self-explanatory if you think about it. And the fact that research shows that around the world, most parents begin potty training at about 2 years old. And so he believed that either overly harsh potty training could lead to greedy adults. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? And so, and of course, here it's the same thing. If being overly harsh could cause issues, and not being harsh enough could cause different issues. At the phallic, which was his third stage, from 3 to 5 years old, was when he believed that happened. He believed that children found their genitalia very fascinating. And honestly, I think he may have been a bit late on this stage. Now, this is my personal knowledge and not research-based, but based on my experience with children, most children discovered their genitalia, especially boys, earlier than 3. But he believed that it was from 3 to 5 years old. And he also espoused some beliefs that this was when he didn't call it gender identity, but where they identified with the same-sex parent and fought with them for the love of the opposite sex parents. He was kind of a little strange. But if you want to hear more about this stage and more about Freud's beliefs on its effects on the other stages, there's a table on page 10 in your book that does a nice job of laying that out. And of course, latency is 6 years to puberty, and during that time, sexual urges became much less important. And then genital was his last stage, and that was puberty through adult. And he really believed that most of the development of children happened before um, age 5, and modern research does not support that theory in that area. Actually, there's a lot of his theory that can't be proved. Even his ideas on so the talking a lot and overeating and all of that, there's no way that research, at least no research to date, has been able um, to conclusively say that that had anything to do with how they were fed or whatever in infancy. So it's a interesting thought, but it's not one that has really panned out when they've done additional research on that, his theory in that. And Erikson, who studied with Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, and she did a lot of child psychological research, developmental research, believed that development didn't stop with adulthood, but that life continued with more developmental stages until death. So let's take a quick look at what he did think. So Erikson developed his own personality stages of development. And this is Erikson's 8 stages of development. And he called his stages psychosocial stages, with the belief that the id had little importance. He didn't believe too much in the id, and emphasized the importance of the psychosocial aspects of behavior. So the attitudes towards oneself and towards others was what he felt like was the most important. And while his first 5 stages correspond age-wise with Freud's, you can see that above that, he carried those stages on into adulthood and all the way to the end of life. And he believed that people continued to develop until the end of life and to have those changes. So, and he believed that in each stage, the person would face what he would call a developmental crisis. Today, we would have probably called those a developmental task. But we're going to talk about these stages individually as we progress through this course. And I just want to briefly talk about the first couple here. In the first year, the stage is trust versus mistrust. And in this year, in this first year of life, if the caregivers provide those infants with what they need, the infant will generally successfully develop trust. But if those needs are not met in that first year of life, if the baby's neglected, if the baby's abused, then it's very difficult for them to bond in later life. And so we'll talk about this when we talk about attachment theories, but the damage that can be done by abuse in this first year of life is just heartbreaking. We've found that many of the people who are, we used to call them antisocial personality disorders, and that's probably a more common name than the one that's used today, and it's probably something that you're more familiar with. But many of the people who ended up as serial killers were actually abused during that first year of life. So, and part of the problem is that this damage from this first stage carries over into the next stage. And if that cycle is not broken, it can carry over for a lifetime. So, but particularly in these first 2, if you don't have trust in your caregivers, then it's very difficult to develop autonomy. If you don't trust people, how can you develop autonomy? So I don't know if we have any preschool teachers in this class, but if we do, they're familiar with the issues that arise if children don't successfully master the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage. That's from years 1 to 3. And it's important during these years that caregivers begin to allow children to make decisions for themselves, because that's how they develop autonomy, is being able to do things and make decisions for themselves. When the caregivers don't allow that, the toddlers don't hear, "Oh, sweetie, I just love you so much. Let me make sure you're beautiful every day and everything is perfect for you." What they hear and what they take from that and what they internalize is, "You're not smart enough or good enough to be able to make decisions. You're not capable of decision making or doing things on your own." And so this means that as they get older, they will struggle with being able to make decisions on their own. And we'll talk about that as we go later. But um, basically, what I want to say here is that caregivers need to allow them space to make some decisions. And that don't mean that you have to let your child go out of the house looking fried, or that you have to let them stick forks in the electric outlets. You can allow them some space to make decisions while still keeping them safe. And so during this age is when children need to learn to dress themselves, and they should be allowed to pick out their own clothes. It's an important thing for them to make choices, or to pick their cup or their plate for their meals, or to pick what they're going to eat. Those are all important things. And if you can't stand those mismatched clothes, then you put together outfits and just let them pick from the outfit. It's okay. I understand that. I have a daughter that's like that. Another daughter is pre-K teacher, and I'll never forget, she's a great believer in the importance of this stage. And so they used to live across the pasture from us, and we used to have goats. And when her first child was about 2.5 or 3 years old, she would let her come across the little pasture to our house. And I'll never forget the day. It was about 85 degrees outside, maybe 90, because I do live in southeastern Oklahoma. And we had some goat buyers at our house to pick up goats. And so here comes this 3-year-old Violet across the pasture. She's barefooted, but she has a ski suit on. If you guys know what a ski suit is, you know this is ridiculous attire. And so I was a little bit embarrassed, and I tried to explain to these goat buyers what was going on, but I'm sure they still thought her parents were just neglectful. But at 12 years old, because she was allowed to make those decisions, even if they were sometimes poor decisions, they didn't hurt her, and she has a very well-developed sense of autonomy. Of course, this is just one example, but they also need to learn to feed themselves, to practice self-control. Now, they're not going to master self-control at 3. That's one that moves on into that next stage with them. But hopefully they will begin to be able to do that. So I've talked about these first 2 stages of Erikson's, and I'm not going to talk about all the rest of them, but I really would like for you to watch the video about it. But basically what I need you to know today is that if you don't meet the crisis or the developmental task of one stage, it's going to be more difficult to meet the next developmental stage. Does that make sense? And so each stage comes with positive and negative feelings, and hopefully the positive outweighs the negative as they move through these stages. And in each stage, the sensitivity and responsiveness of others towards whatever they're trying to master will create a context, will create an environment for their development. And so in all of the stages, according to Erikson, the attitudes towards self and towards others, they emerge together. They're 2 sides of a whole. And so, for instance, if you can't trust yourself, then you're not going to trust others. And Erikson's personality theory is still very widely accepted, It's the one that you will see in nursing programs. It's the one that you will see in helping professionals and psychologists. And I believe that part of the reason may be that Erickson's theory is just so much more helpful than Freud's because it focuses on the thoughts and the feelings that our students and our clients come to us needing help addressing. How do I learn to feel confident in my decision making abilities? How do I learn to trust others? So um, a strong understanding of this theory will help you. It'll help you with the certification test. It'll help you with this course, but most of all, it will help you throughout your career. So also there will be questions about Erickson's theory on this week's exam, which is also important, right? So I know I need to move along quickly, but what I'd like to do is stop here and pick up with Piaget's cognitive development when I come back. So we will have a part 2 that will start with Piaget's cognitive development, which most of you are probably more familiar with than you may have been with the other different